to our first guest speaker in our speaker series, Drew Hayden Taylor. We're certainly extremely appreciative of you joining us today to start this off. And the first thing I'm going to ask is if everyone could turn off their video camera and their microphone, except for Drew, obviously. That will help with our bandwidth and will hopefully make everything go a little bit smoother. And so we don't want to lose anybody. And I'm sure we're going to have people coming on as we go forward today with this. And that's totally fine. I just want to make sure that everybody can get on with some success. And I should introduce myself. Seg what swag Troy Young Yachts. My name is Troy Maracle and I'm from Tyndonega, and I am the Indigenous Education Lead for Hastings and Prince Edward, which is what we are all part of. The reason that we're doing this, we are having a speaker series, and I've invited 6 different speakers who are going to be giving us different presentations or just question and answer, just spending some time with us talking about their work. We have authors and writers like Drew today, but we also have artists that are going to be coming up in the weeks ahead. So naturally, I would have loved to have had speakers in front of you in person, but obviously we couldn't do that. So this is our next best thing. So again, I'm super appreciative of Drew and the others who have agreed to be a part of this virtual learning session and speaker series. So there are a number of things. Again, I'm just going to ask that everybody shut off their cameras and their microphones so that we can save the bandwidth and we can all tune in fine. If there are questions or things that come up, put them in the chat box and we'll try to get to them. But I do want everyone to know that we are recording this so that we can go back and we can listen to it later, and also so it can be shared with the classroom, with the students that weren't able to participate. So with that, I think, Drew, I didn't do a biography for you or list all of the titles and things that you've been working on or have already published, but maybe you could start off, Drew, and tell us a little bit about yourself and some of your work. And as I said, I have other questions that students and teachers have prepared, and I'll just chime in with those after a while.
Sounds great. Okay, well, as you indicated, my name is Drew Hayden Taylor. I was born, raised, and live on the Curve Lake First Nation, just north of Peterborough, Ontario. I am what you would call a contemporary storyteller. That is to say, in the 21st century, there's so many different ways of telling stories, and I'm trying to explore as many of them as I can. So as a result, I've written for television, I've written stage, I've written novels, short stories, documentaries, all different kinds of writing, and finding, basically the way I see it is I'm finding new ways to explore the Indigenous experience. Because in this day and age, as I'm sure you know, first of all, we used to start off with everything was oral storytelling, and then print was introduced, and then you had radio, television, theater, all these different ways. And in today's world, the 21st century, even video games have strong growing narratives within them. So part of my fun and direction as a writer is exploring as many of these as tickles my fancy, as a way of again, as I said, exploring and celebrating the Indigenous world. Hello?
Yeah, no, that's great. That's great. So I should tell you that when you're talking, I'm shutting off my camera and my mic too. So.
All right, gotcha. I understand now.
So there might just be a little bit of a delay, but it's all good. It's all good.
As we say on my reserve, bueno.
When- Sounds good. I don't think we should get into all of the different things that different communities say. You know, like my wife, she's from Wikwemicong, Wiki as we know it, and I know you've spent some time there. And one of the
I
things,
call it done time.
well, there's a lot of artists that have come from that community, I tell you, and I feel fortunate that I can go there and spend some time. That's for sure. Um, So one of the things, Drew, that people have been wondering about is, you know, how did you get your start, and how do you feel you've had a good start and been successful as a writer?
Well, my journey is actually, I find it quite odd that I'm doing what I'm doing. Like I've always wanted to be, I always wanted to be a writer. I always was intrigued by the concept of creation. And I mean, when growing up on my reserve back in the 60s and 70s, I'm sure it's true in a lot of other reserves in small towns, things could get kind of boring. There's only so many trees you can climb, so many times you can go swimming. So I would read, especially in wintertime, right? We had two television stations. And for those old enough to understand this terminology, both of them were quite snowy at times. So I would read because I always pictured every book was like a passport to some new place, new people, new adventures. And I would read and read and read, and it took me to exotic places that I never thought I would ever go. And it gave me the opportunity to meet people I didn't think I would ever meet. So the more I read, the more I became interested in the concept of writing. And the and so every book I read, it was like a brick in the wall, in the stairway to achieving what I wanted to achieve. And but I didn't at that time back when I was in school in the 70s. To the best of my knowledge, there were no other real native writers. I didn't know if Native people were allowed to write, could write, or whatever, because they weren't in the school system. We had our library on the reserve was quite pitiful. I think it consisted of 7 books published in the 1940s. So I thought I did want to do some, I guess, research, for lack of a better term. And as is the Indigenous way, I decided to consult those who were older and wiser than me. The first person I went to consult was my grade 11 English teacher. And I went up to him, and I distinctly remember him saying, he was sitting at his desk. He was looking for something in the bottom left-hand corner of his desk. And I went up to him and I said, "Sir, is it possible to make a living from creative writing?" And without even looking up, he said, "No, not really." And that stayed with me. That was sort of my first introduction to sticking my big toe in the sea of writing. My English teacher telling me there's not much point in being a writer. And I'm also a firm believer that the best revenge is living a good life. So as the decades went by and I started writing and I became somewhat of a successful writer, one of the things I often get asked to do is I often get asked to lecture and talk at high schools, universities, colleges, etc. And when I go out there and I talk to young people, I always say the one thing I can share with you, the only thing you need to remember from me when you walk out that door, the only piece of good information you need to take with me is never trust your grade 11 English teacher. So my English teacher said not to bother being a writing. I went to tell my mother. I told my mother I wanted to be a writer, and my mother looked at me with a very perplexed look, saying, in her very words, "Why do you want to be a writer? It's not going to get you anywhere." And again, that sort of stayed with me. That sort of hurt. My mother telling me, "Why do you want to be a writer? It's not going to get you anywhere." But the thing is, I knew as I got older, I sort of deconstructed what my mother had said, and I sort of began to understand it, because Anishinaabe was her first language. She had a grade 6 education. She'd spent most of her life cooking, cleaning for white people. So the idea of being a writer was just literally not on her radar. So there was a philosophy of unless you were working class, you had no class. So these two people told me that there was no point in being a writer. So who am I to argue with these two very important people in my life? So I gave up wanting to be a writer. And as luck would have it, also another important thing was happening around that time. As I said, this was grade 11. And the reserve I grew up on, Curve Lake, when I was growing up, it was actually quite small. It was about 800 people. But at the same time, I came from a very big family. My mother was the oldest of 14 children, which is, as I'm sure you know, what used to happen before they had the internet. And then, so I come from a big family, but I also come from a small family. I'm a single child of a single parent. And so putting those two things together, as I neared the end of high school, it became apparent to me that I was related to practically every girl on the reserve. So that was as good a reason as any to go off to college. So I ended up going to college in Toronto for radio and television broadcasting, which was like the silliest thing I could have picked. Basically, I went through that book they have of colleges, universities, and courses, and I was looking for something to take. I'd wanted to be a writer. I was told not to be a writer. So I ended up picking radio and television, which was like a very silly thing to pick, but I picked it because I thought I watched television, I listened to radio. How hard can it be? And it was for journalism. So I ended up learning sort of broadcast journalism, which was kind of odd because within 5 years, everything I learned became outdated. And I started kicking around. To make a long story short, which I probably already not done, it was about 8 years or so between my mother and my grade 11 English teacher telling me not to become a writer before my art came, tracked me down, kicked me in the ass, and basically said, "You are a writer, and it's about time you've started writing." Because prior to then, I kicked around Toronto. I was lurching from contract to contract. I didn't have a job. I didn't have a career. I had jobs. So like I worked for the Canadian Native Arts Foundation, now called Inspire. I worked for them for a while. I worked for CBC Radio as a trainee radio producer. I did the sound on a couple of documentaries, and I ended up working for a television series as basically low-level jobs, production assistant, casting assistant, chaperone, etc. But it was while I was there that I developed, because I had to take these scripts and break them down, I sort of learned the structure of a half-hour television drama. And as I sort of did that, and I began to learn the structure, because 50%, 60% of all writing is understanding the structure of the story you're writing. So that a year after that ended, through a bizarre series of circumstances, I got an opportunity to write, I was asked to submit a story outline for a television series. And just because I was curious, I thought I'd do it for the hell of it. I did it. They bought the first one. And out of nowhere, I found myself writing an episode of a series called The Beachcombers. And so I started writing television, did Beachcombers, North of 60, Street Legal, and then I went into writing articles and essays, and then I went into writing theater, then I went into writing short stories, then I went into writing novels, and so on and so on and so on. So all of that is how I ended up doing what I'm doing today.
No, that's great. I didn't realize that you had done any writing for television before. I knew you had done the essays and whatnot, and you were doing some work with CBC. And obviously, I know of your other works, your plays and novels and whatnot. But I know there's a lot of people who are wondering, which one do you like the best? First of all, that's one of the questions, and I guess maybe another one that you could address is a lot of your work has a lot of humor and satire. And what role or why is it that you use that so much in your writing?
Okay, first question. Which one do I like most? Well, I like all of them, or I wouldn't do them. So that's a difficult question. Other than the fact, I think I'd have to say playwriting, because that is what essentially made my career. And I think it was Arthur Miller who once said he can describe more in one page of dialogue than in 10 pages of prose. So I'm at heart, I think I'm a playwright. However, there's so many different ways of telling stories, and I don't like to limit myself to just one way of telling stories. So I like to play around with all the different ways. That way, it keeps me sort of interested on the go and telling new stories in new ways. And you know, part of the responsibility in today's world of being a writer is, okay, you come up with an idea, you have to figure out, is the best way to tell a story a play? Is it a novel? Is it a television show, movie? Is it a documentary? Is it a poem? What is it? So that's part of the fun of it. And then you sit down and you start putting your heart and effort into it. And both require different muscles, because I'll finish a novel, I'll go work on a play, I'll work on an article, I'll work on a television show, and people will say, "Don't you get what's that term when you can't, writer's block? Don't I get writer's block?" And I say no, because I'm using different muscles. It's like working out in a gym on body training. Some days you'll work legs, some day you'll work back and arms, some day you'll work chest, etc. Working different muscles for me means I can work on different projects, because it's different part of the brain I'm using in writing these. Also, when you're writing, depending on, you know, people say I'm a writer, and I always say, well, what kind? There's so many different ways of writing. Be specific. It's like saying you're a scientist or something. There's so many different versions of scientists. So when people say they're writers, I ask what kind, because what branch you focus on, right? If you're a novelist, if you're a television writer, if you're a playwright, they all have different benefits. And I'll give you an example. When you are writing a play, basically you can make a little bit of a living in theater. The average person has a play produced every 1 to 3 years, and the money's in making in remounts and getting adopted into courses. But that's not always the way. Some people have a story to tell, they want to tell it, and then they move on to their next story. But the thing with theater is, if you look at the book, the poster, it's a playwright's medium. When it's produced, you cannot change a single word of what the playwright has written unless you have specific permission from that playwright. And the other thing being with television, television is different. And I've been told this. In television, they say the writing is important, but the writer isn't. In television, the story producers, the directors, and even the actors can rewrite the script. You're being paid for the idea, not specifically the words. And you got to make a lot more money in television than you do in theater, but you get much less recognition and much less control. And when I say recognition, like, you go out and you ask the average Canadian who has some understanding of the Canadian artistic community, you know, name 5 Canadian playwrights. The chances are most of them will come up with 3 to 5. But say, name a Canadian television scriptwriter. Most of them won't, right? So, and I've known people who have written television shows, who have written like 3, 4 shows of a series, but will not watch it because they don't want to see how it's been rewritten. I wrote an episode of North of 60, and when I saw the final product, there was like maybe 7 or 8 words in it that were originally mine. So you have to go into it with a thick skin. So so different genres best suit different stories that you're telling. And so when I sit back, I try and figure out, okay, what's the best way to tell the story? Going on to your second question about humor, that's sort of been my niche. When I started out 30 years ago, nobody was doing a lot of humor. This was pre Dead Dog Cafe or Tom King, all these different things. And I actually would get a little bit of criticism. I actually got a lot of compliments. Once I used to write a lot of articles and essays for the Globe and Mail, and they would basically explore important issues happening in the First Nations community, but through humor. And one time, Thompson Highway came up to me for an article I think I did on the political correctness of names, what to call Native people. And he said, you know, somebody had to talk about it, and I'm glad you did it with humor. But a lot of people think humor is like the illegitimate son of literature or social commentary. I had one artistic director of a native theater company once tell me specifically when I was being hired to write a play, Drew, I know you can be funny. I want you to be serious. But for me, I've been very fortunate. I've traveled to over 150 First Nation communities across Canada and the United States. And every single community I've been to, I've been greeted with a laugh, a smile, and a joke. I just find humor is so intrinsic to First Nation cultures. But you look at the vast majority of our literature that's been coming out for the last 30, 40 years, and the vast majority of it is dark, depressing, bleak, sad, and angry. Basically, there are essentially three types of narratives that have been embraced by most of our writers. Victim narratives, historical narratives, or the byproducts of what I refer to as post-contact stress disorder. And for me, I was listening to I was visiting an elder on a blood reserve in Alberta who told me that in his opinion, for Native people, humor is the WD-40 of healing. That is to say, it helps, it promotes, it encourages healing. And I think it was either Polygon Allen or Leslie Marmon Silko, a fellow three-named author from the States, who said that frequently the best way to know a people is through what makes them laugh. And because of my upbringing on the reserve and my travels and all that, humor seems so intrinsic to the Indigenous experience that it seems odd that I was one of the only people that was embracing it and using it in my writing. So I don't think it's so much the same anymore. I think more people are exploring that. But I just find that humor, it's like that song from Mary Poppins, a spoonful of sugar helps the medicine go down. You can approach the same issues that dramatic writers do through humor. And I think Tom King once used this metaphor of, you have somebody standing on a box on a street corner, screaming out at the world. People will walk by, stop, look at them for a second, shake their head, and walk on. But if you use humor to tell that same story, they'll stop, they'll listen, they'll laugh, and they'll take that, possibly that joke, that information, that argument back home with them and share it. So for me, and for me also, as selfish and personal as this is, it's fun. I just find it very fun and interesting to write humor. If I want to depress somebody, I'll write something with dead cats and starving children. There, you're depressed. Whereas humor is where you take the same amount of information, you deconstruct it, you reconstruct it, and present it to your audience in a new, interesting, and hopefully funny manner. And yeah, I guess that's about it.
No, that's really good. And you and I joke around a lot on Twitter about butter tarts and whether or not they have raisins or not, or they should. And I would agree 100%. I haven't been to that many First Nations communities, but that is one thing that I can say is that we laugh all the time. We're constantly, even if it is a bad situation, we are still laughing, and it's a way, I guess, that we use it to cope with some of the things.
Definitely. So I can even give you some examples. For instance, one of my comedies, I forget which one it was, a 2-act comedy. Every time it's produced, the stage manager writes down the time of each act. It's just part of the procedure, so you know how long the play is going. And there's one play, and also I should add before I finish with that thought, the thing about in doing humor, Indigenous humor, and people say, do I write for a Native crowd, do I write for a white crowd? It's completely irrelevant, because the things that there are more similarities between Native people and non-Native people than there are differences when it comes to something like humor, right? When I go home at the end of the day, or actually in this current environment, I actually never leave the house during the day, but when I sit and watch television or whatever, I watch the same comedic shows that the vast majority of Canadians watch, you know, Big Bang Theory, Family Guy, Simpsons, whatever, and I laugh. And 90% of the people who read my novels or come and see my plays are non-native, and all my humor comes from my upbringing on the res. And they find, obviously, because 90% of my audience, just by sheer population and ratio wise, is non-native, they get the humor. So in terms of oh, I forgot where I was going with this. Oh yes, the production. So I do a play, a full scale comedy play, right? 90% of the audience is non-native, just because there's, you know, in Toronto there's more theater going white people than native people, in Thunder Bay, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So when in an odd occasion, when one of my plays has been running, and say the play is the first act of a play runs 52 minutes, normal audience with lots and lots of laughter, right? On certain occasions when there is a conference or a busload of native people coming in and the audience is half to 2/3 native, there have been documented cases where the actual length of the act has been increased by 4 to 5 minutes from laughter, from waiting for the laughter to die down, because native people will either they get more of the jokes or they appreciate the jokes more and will laugh longer and more frequently. And 4 to 5 minutes in one act is a lot of time.
That's hilarious, but it doesn't surprise me. It really doesn't. I guess moving things along here, I think it's super important for this course, for a lot of the work that we're doing in Indigenous studies, that we talk about identity. So, you know, from your perspective, why do you think that it's important for students to look at and consider identity from an Indigenous perspective?
Oh, I don't know. Looking at it from the Indigenous perspective, I don't know how to answer that question.
No, that's fair, and I think it's if we think about it, different people have different influences on their identity, and some of those influences come out in your work. So
yeah,
I guess my question could be, I guess, why do you think then it's important that students study Indigenous writers as a lens to their identity?
Right. Well, let me go back to my own personal battle or exploration of identity. Right. Obviously, growing up on a reserve, looking the way I do, the bluish eyes, the light brown hair. I went through my phase, especially when I left the reserve, because I come from such a big family. It was never really an issue on my reserve. But when I moved to Toronto, and it became very obvious that I didn't look or act the way most people think Indigenous people should look, even Indigenous people, I went through a bit of an identity crisis. You know, my standard joke, I'm half Ojibwe, half Caucasian, so technically that makes me an Occasion. So I went through this period where I wrote about, that was basically the focus point of a lot of my work. You're probably familiar with Pretty Like a White Boy, Adventures of a Blue-Eyed Ojibwe, which I wrote, I did the basis of in one angry night after an altercation with a cab driver. And I wrote it when I was angry, trying to get the stuff all out of me. And then I sort of, you know, put it together, edited it together over a period of a week, because basically it was one page rant, dot, 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 dot. And the ideas were there, but not the structure. So it took me a while to put it together. And I decided to, and I published it in a magazine, not really thinking it would go anywhere, because who the hell cares about Drew Hayden Taylor and his identity issues? Lo and behold, it became one of, and still is one of the most popular things I have ever written, because it looks at identity, and almost everybody out there in this universe has their own encounter with identity issues. And again, I did it through humor. And the rule of law says the specifics are often universal. So with this particular piece, I went in, I did it, and it became surprisingly successful. And it's in a number of books, publishing, whatever. So the whole identity thing became, both consciously and unconsciously, part of my entry into the world of writing. A lot of my early writing deals with the exploration of identity. Toronto at Dreamers Rock. 3 16-year-old boys on the way to the top of Dreamers Rock, talking about what it means to be native, to all three of them, because they come from 3 different time periods where the definition is different. Again, that was me sort of exploring that. My trilogy about native adoption. Someday, only drunks and children tell the truth. 400 kilometers. An adoption story. The Scoop Up. That is an exploration of identity too, dealing with that. So a lot of my early stuff, and still to this day, does deal with the exploration of identity. So I think understanding who we are, where we come from, and how that influences us can give up-and-coming writers, can give people just trying to find their place in society a better grasp of who they are and where they stand and where they're going. And I'll give you an example. A very well-known older Cree poet came to me once. We were at some function. She said her grandson was fairer than me. He had blonde hair, all that, but they were raising him to be a Cree man, and he was going to this high school, where 3/4 of the population were Cree, and they were teasing him because he was, quote, trying to be Cree when he didn't look very Cree, and they were teasing him, and he was having some sort of problems with it. She said she wanted to ask me, as somebody who's gone through it and come out the other side of success, do I have any words of wisdom I can pass on and share with him? And I said, yes, I do. Tell him I have made a fortune off the way I look. Basically, what I've done is I've taken something that some could consider a problem, that could be considered a difficulty, something to deal with. I've turned something negative into a positive. I started off writing stuff from the perspective of identity, which I was wrestling with, and then it became a success. I began to make a living from it, and I used that as a springboard to exploring other different topics that may not have been available for me had I not gone through that procedure. There you go.
No, that's fantastic, and I think it's spot on. Personally, I've often said, yes, I'm pigmentally challenged too, but you go with it, right? But when you have the last name of Taylor or Miracle, when someone says Taylor, I automatically think of Curve Lake. That's just my go-to, and it's the same with Miracle. Well, you're either from Tyndonega or Six Nations, so names mean a lot, and where you're from sometimes too. But I'm glad you touched on Toronto at Dreamers Rock, because that's one that resonates with a lot of people because of the identity. And someone asked, is there a character that you relate to more than the other two from that particular play?
Well, Toronto Dreamers Rock was first produced 31 years ago, the fall of '89, and I think it was published in 1990. So 30 years ago this year it was published. I look back on it, I see the odd production. It's not produced as much as it was, but it was one of the most popular plays produced for the long time, especially for touring shows to schools. And I look back at it now, and I just find it so dated. I read sections, I hear some sections done, and I just sort of wince at it, because it was essentially my very first play. Do I see myself as any of the characters in it? That's hard to say. A very good friend of mine, Herbie Barnes, who was in a lot of my early plays, would swear up and down that I was actually one of the characters in all my plays. That I would put myself into one character in each play. And I obviously I'm going to whip out and do the playwright thing and say I'm in all of my characters. I mean, I like the childish view of Cusack trying to make sense of the world around him. My love of science fiction is sort of personified in Michael and Rusty. We've all been Rusty. We've all been that angry young man trying to again find his place in society, trying to find his identity, where he fits. So I'm not any one character. No, no. I like to think I'm all of those characters in one way or another.
No, that's I could see that. That's fair. Now, moving on to Dead White Writer, I'll read out some of the questions here. They're around the ending. Why did you make the ending like you did? And you know, I hope I know there's probably some students out there who haven't quite finished yet. Uh, but people are really wondering about the ending and why did you plan to end the play the way you did? And was there intentions? Was there a message that you were trying to send there?
Jeez, do I have to tell you everything?
Hey, this is coming from the students.
Well, first things first, and this is a legitimate question. Dead White Writer on the Floor has been only produced twice, and it's one of my favorites. But of the 15 or 16 or 17 plays I've had published, don't even know how many I've had published. This one seems to get a lot of tread in school systems. And I'm curious for people out there, why that play? It seems unusually popular in an academic environment. Well, I don't know if I can get a response back because everybody's all turned off. I'm just curious about that. But let me go back to answering your question. The ending. I heard a story once, and this may be one of those theater stories that if it's not true, it should be, where, oh God, now I've got to go back. Waiting for Godot by Samuel Beckett. Somebody supposedly, and I don't know if this is true, went to Samuel Beckett 30 years after Waiting for Godot premiered in the 50s and said, it's been 30 years, it's defined as a classic, everybody knows the play, but now 30 years later, you know, it's been dissected to death. Who is Godot? And supposedly Samuel Beckett looked at them and said, if I knew that, I would put it in a play.
So I guess that would answer the next question I was going to ask is how did the white writer die? That was another question.
Well, okay, now let me go back here. So the ending of that play, it came to me. I wanted to do something metaphysical. I wanted to do something different, unusual, where it could mean almost anything. And it's one of these things where I'm more interested in what people think it meant to what it actually meant to what it could mean. That, I mean, this sounds like I'm dropping out of the question, but seriously, I do not have a hard, fast, this is exactly what it means. It means something to me, and hopefully it means something to what other people who have read it, what it means to them.
No, that's fair. Totally fair. And you know, you've done just
and what? Sorry. What is the Dead White Writer dead? That's a good question. Maybe not.
Well, you've done a lot of speaking, as you mentioned. You've done a lot of speaking at high schools and universities to different students. Are you seeing an increase of knowledge? Are you with the students as far as Indigenous perspectives and history in Canada, Canada's true history? So, are you seeing an increase in that?
I think so. Yeah, I've been doing this. I've been doing the lecture circuit off and on for about 20, 25 years. And I think, yeah, there is a more growing awareness of the issues out there. And almost to the point of where, again, one of the things I was trying to do in Dead White Writer, dealing with contemporary stereotypes, yeah, everybody seems to be focused now on residential schools and the scoop up. And, one of the things I try and do in my work is show there's so many different aspects to the various native cultures more than just that. So I try and do this, try and do that, and shed different lights on what's going on out there. But yes, I would have to say, for the most part, there is more of a growing awareness of this. 25 years ago, when I started out lecturing, I don't think people knew what a residential school was. Nowadays, say when I'm in a high school or even a college or university, I will get asked if I went to residential school or if I knew people who went to residential school. So yeah, there is more of an awareness out there than there was when I originally started.
Yeah, and you segued perfectly into another question around stereotypes. What do you think is the toughest, or what do you consider to be the toughest stereotype that Indigenous people are facing today?
I don't know if there's one, but there's still stuff out there that lingers that just is so annoying. Uh, one of them, several of them. First of all, the whole thing that the vast number of indigenous people are alcoholics. Yes, there are native people who drink, but there are far more who don't drink, and far more who drink moderately, like the white society. And I draw that equation with also the other one that drives me up the wall, that all native communities are poverty stricken. There are, what is it, 630 First Nation communities across Canada, United States. And if you were to take 630 small towns across Canada and do a spotlight on them, some would be poverty stricken, some would be middle class, and some would be quite wealthy. I have been to wealthy First Nation communities. I have been to poverty stricken First Nations community. My reserve is actually quite middle class. So one of the things I try and tell people is, yes, there are problematic communities, many of them, but not all of them. So there's still that bit of education going on. And same as I said, same with the whole alcoholism thing. You take a random number of people, some will be heavy drinkers, some will be moderate drinkers, some will not drink at all. It's just dealing with those kind of those stereotypes. And of course, the other one about that native people don't pay taxes. I live on a reserve, but the vast majority of my income comes from off reserve, so I have to pay taxes. So there's still a lot of education necessary to go on, necessary to continue out there off the reserve.
Yeah, I can attest to that too.
Yeah, Tandanega, that's a pretty middle class reserve, isn't it?
Yeah, for sure, for sure. So one of the questions that I think may have come from a teacher, and I think you'll see why, but do you see more Indigenous texts being embraced in classrooms more often as part of a more inclusive representative canon?
That's okay. That's a mouthful. Um,
Yeah.
Yes, I'd have to say, obviously. I mean, up in Peterborough, I think the Peterborough board has started instituting mandatory Indigenous literature courses. Universities are starting to do that. Yes, I definitely think there's a much more broader inclusion of Indigenous literature into the educational system than there was a long time ago. Way back when, basically one of the only books that were being studied, say back in the 80s and early 90s, was conceivably Half Breed by oh god, the Métis
Maria
community
Campbell.
Maria Campbell. Thank you very much. Who I actually know and absolutely adore. So yeah, I mean, I often like to think that the Canadian the Canadian Indigenous literary renaissance began in 1986, November 22nd, 8 p.m. The wind was out of the east. That's
and
when
the
a play
subject
called The
matter,
Res Sisters premiered in downtown Toronto and
yeah.
revolutionized the theater community in Canada. And then it was published the following year. And then it basically opened the doors to Canadian theater and Canadian publishing. The fact that Indigenous people had stories to tell. They were interesting stories. They were fascinating stories. And more importantly, for the publishing and theater community, there were stories, the dominant culture that Canadians were interested in reading. And then there's been this flood of literature coming out in the last 30 years that has basically been amazingly successful, and has allowed people like me to survive and prosper and just share the Indigenous brand of storytelling.
And we're appreciative of it. So being cognizant of the time, there's two questions, two last questions, and the first one is, what are you reading these days, and maybe you have suggestions for the students to read. And the last one would be, of course, everybody's going to want to know, what are you working on?
All right.
What's in the queue?
All right. What I'm really sort of getting into these days is sort of because of my interest in Indigenous sci-fi. As you know, I did a book of my own of Indigenous sci-fi. Has been this explosion. I talk about the different mediums I write in: film, television, novels, short stories, etc. Well, what's even more interesting is the explosion of genre fiction within the First Nations community. It used to be, as I said, there were those three narrative structures that basically almost all the novels that were being written tiptoed through. But within the last 5-10 years, there's been this fabulous explosion of genre fiction. Daniel Heath Justice has wrote a trilogy of novels. Basically, it's an Indigenous Lord of the Rings with dwarves, elves, swords, magic, etc. And it has been very popular. Catteriackwinzi Dam edited and published a book of international Indigenous erotica, which I like to think of as 50 Shades of Red. Tom King, when not writing award-winning fiction and nonfiction, he writes murder mysteries, which is so cool. My first novel was a native vampire novel. My second novel was a brand of literature I didn't even know existed when I wrote it, called Magic Realism. I did the collection of native sci-fi, and now native sci-fi seems to be incredibly popular. You've got Sherry Demerlane's The Marrow Thieves. You've got Wab Gijik Rice's Moon of the Crusted Snow. Down in the States, you've got Rebecca Roanhorse's Trail of Lightning. She's a Pueblo Indian whose husband is Navajo, and basically her novel takes place on the Navajo reservation after some apocalypse. They built a wall around the reserve, and the gods have come back. And the book was so popular, so successful in general fiction, and like general in Canadian or American reading, that she was hired by the Star Wars Corporation to write one of their Star Wars novels, which came out and became very, very popular. So I'm reading Indigenous sci-fi right now and trying my best to keep up. What am I doing now? I am working on a number of things. I'm 2/3 of the way through a novel, a horror novel, which is so much fun to write. I'm having so much fun doing it. I have, I've been doing a television series, a documentary series with APTN, sort of exploring and celebrating some of the interesting, unusual things Indigenous people are doing out there today that you don't normally associate with Indigenous culture. It's called Going Native. We've done episodes on Indigenous gourmet cooking, Indigenous fashion, even Indigenous pop culture, because there seems to be this growing fondness for Indigenous zombie movies, etc. So we're doing 13 episodes of that. I did a couple of years ago, I did a documentary on the German preoccupation with North American Aboriginal culture. and it was very, very successful. And I did a play recently, 2 years ago, called Cottagers and Indians, about the disagreement between native and non-native land and water issues. And it was a play about that. We've done a documentary sort of on that and expanding, looking at broader aspects in Canada about those disagreements. So yeah, so I'm doing all of that right now.
Well, that's amazing. And, you know, honestly, Drew, there are so many different places we could go with the conversation, because that would be another one that I'd like to explore a little bit further, is around that whole issue of sovereignty, and how are we exploring sovereignty and those issues in
Actually, I saw
in
a
our,
question go by about
in our
15
work.
minutes ago. Somebody asked something about motorcycles and sweetgrass, and I don't know who that was, but that was the only question I saw pop up here.
Yeah, there was one on motorcycles and sweetgrass, and I think there was another one that popped up just there was one about chasing painted horses. I know that there's some people who have looked at that, and it was really exciting. The question about motorcycles and sweetgrass was this. You start with a tug of war of sorts between Jesus and Nanabush, and finish with Nanabush doing Jesus' water walking trick with his motorcycle. Alanis King makes a more direct comparison or contrast with the two figures in her play. What are your thoughts on the relationship of these two figures, and why is the pairing so popular?
I remember seeing Alanis King's play 20 years ago. What's my Well, I mean, one of my favorite things I've ever written was the scene where they both meet in the Glen and start talking. Where one says, "You're shorter than I thought," and the other one's saying, "You're not as dark as I thought." So just I had actually that book was part of in a lot of book clubs, and it was at a book club held at an Anglican church. And the person leading the book club was the minister of the Anglican church. And she always said, and I consider this one of the biggest compliments I've ever gotten, was she said, I always envision in my mind that's exactly how Jesus would be. Kind of funny, kind of relatable, very, very cool. So I think that for me that was a major success, considering that I could have gotten into a whole lot of trouble. What's the relationship between the two? It's hard to say. They both have two different origins. Thompson Highway has a very great essay, and I don't know if it's at the beginning of Red Sisters or Dried Ups, the published versions, where you have Jesus, who's basically born of pain. He dies in pain. He dies for your sin. So there's guilt and pain involved, where you have this Nanabush character who basically is there to make fun of anything and everything. Tom King views Nanabush as a creature of appetites. You don't trust him. And I've tried to take that route in my writing. So I don't know if I don't know if they're born of the same parent, shall we say, but I'm sure the fact that they have the best intentions towards humanity at their heart gives them something to break bread over, using a metaphor.
Well, it's always interesting, and when you can speak to an author about their work. I remember spending time with Richard Wagamese shortly after Indian Horse was published, and the insights and whatnot I was able to get from spending time with him was invaluable. And I know that today, hearing you speak and talk about the different plays is going to be as impactful with the students as it was for me at that time with Richard. So I really appreciate you taking the time with us today, and I'm sure and I know that you've generated more things to think about and more questions. And what I'm going to do is encourage the teachers and students to write those questions out, and then maybe I can forward those on to you, and we can go from there. But again, Drew, thank you so much, and thank you everyone for tuning in. Yes, I especially liked the little dig that you did for grade 11 teachers, because that's what most of these people, the teachers is grade 11, our grade 11 English teacher. So that was a lot of fun. So
yeah, well, there's still time for my opinion to change. And if I may just add one little thing, I don't know. Just this winter, I had a new book come out called "Chasing Painted Horses," which is from the perspective of kids on the reserve, and it's my exploration of art, of wanting to do better things. It's one of my most favorite things I've ever written, and it hasn't gotten the the publicity I think it should have gotten. So I want to tell everybody out there, go out and buy Chasing Painted Horses.
yeah, that it is a good one for sure. And I know one of our teachers, Tara Prance from Center Hastings, loves that book, and would love to explore that even further. But I would strongly encourage people to dive into that as well. So again, thank you everyone, and I'll send out another invite to our next speaker. And Drew, I will be in touch with you shortly. Take care, everyone.
It was fun.
Okay. Take care. Thanks, folks.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you, Drew. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much, Drew.